This is Jim Shapiro, professor of English at Columbia University and author of a number of books about Shakespeare, as well as a documentary, Shakespeare the King's Man. And you are listening to Dave's Gone By on UNC Radio.
Welcome back to Dave's Gone By, and on this episode and in this segment, we're going to talk about William Shakespeare. All right, please don't turn off your computers, don't start the crickets chirping. I promise you, this is going to be worth hearing, fun, interesting, and intriguing, because we're going to be talking about Shakespeare with James Shapiro. He is an author. He is now also a documentarian, if you can believe, and amidst all that, he's a professor of English at Columbia University. Okay, I know, I'm trying not to scare you off with all this stuff. He also is an amazing Shakespeare expert and makes his world and his work come alive. So it is a real exciting pleasure for me to talk to James Shapiro. First of all, welcome to the Daverhood.
Thanks so much for having me on the program.
You're most welcome. And one of the reasons I figured this would be exciting is he hasn't just written books like Contested Will, a.k.a. Who Wrote Shakespeare's Plays, because there's been supposed controversy about who actually did most of the writing of the Bard's plays. He's also the author of A Year in the Life of Shakespeare, where he takes one particular year, part of the Elizabethan period, and just dissects it culturally and socially. And he also wrote something called Shakespeare and the Jews that I definitely want to talk about as well. But most of all, to my shame, I had never heard of this man until they put out this new DVD called Shakespeare the King's Man. From Athena is the publisher on that. And it's a 3-part series talking about how, even though we think of Shakespeare as an Elizabethan playwright, half of his work almost, and some of his most important plays, were written during the Jacobean period under King James. And it totally kind of changed the framework and the content of what Shakespeare was writing to an extent. Well, that's enough of my talking. Why don't you tell us, James, about the DVD and what you're accomplishing with it?
Sure. One of the things you learn as a writer is sometimes 10,000, sometimes 100,000 people will buy and read your book. But if you make a documentary, and this first aired last spring on the BBC on television in Britain, 500,000, 1 million, 1.5 million will follow your thoughts and follow your ideas. So as much as I enjoy writing books, I really like reaching as many people as I can. So it was a fun change of pace to leave the classroom and to leave the study and just walk the streets of London and do a documentary, which is something I've never done. And for a kid from Brooklyn, where I was born, and you can hear it in my accent, to go to London and do a documentary for the BBC that's now selling and playing around the world was a huge thrill.
Hey, look, I'm a kid from Brooklyn, too. Ocean
Parkway, man. So you know.
Yeah, go Brooklyn! But let me ask, okay, so you've written these books, and you've obviously been a Shakespeare scholar for all these years. In the making of the documentary, was your participation writing the script? Was it beyond that? Did you have to select the locations? I mean, how much physical activity were you doing as part of the DVD, as opposed to other people?
That's a great question, and the people I compete against in the market of doing these kind of programs, people like Simon Schama and other real greats at this, have a team of people that's really deep. Many of them do the researching and the writing, others scout for sites. I had a really small and terrific team, and the first thing I did was write 200 or 300 pages of ideas that I thought would be really quite good, and then sat down with a director, a really smart guy named Stephen Clark, and we locked ourselves away in a hotel for a couple of weeks, drinking a lot of coffee. He'd step out for cigarettes every 15 minutes, and after about a couple of weeks, we knocked together a script. And what I didn't know, I'm used to standing in front of a class and have done that for 25 years. I can talk all day, but when you're doing a documentary, you can't talk all day. Somebody has to give you 18 words that take 15 seconds to deliver, and you have to do them verbatim. Even if they're your own words, it turns out that it's hard to memorize and perform just like that. So the hardest thing for me was not researching this 3-hour documentary or sitting down with Steve and working out how to translate the 200 or 300 pages of ideas into a script, or even driving around England finding great places to shoot. But it was memorizing my own written words and speaking them on camera, which was brutal.
Huh. That's interesting. I mean, you're certainly very natural. You're very measured, I will say that. You talk slowly and very succinctly.
Yeah, but you missed the first 49 takes before that 50th take, where I managed to do it without screwing up in the last 2 or 3 sentences or words. It's actually a skill, and I've never acted professionally, and learning how to speak to the camera is something that no one ever taught me. And I had a really patient crew. The camera guys were great. The sound guys were great. A lot of this was filmed outside in London. And if you or any of your listeners have ever spent time in central London, an airplane flies over every 40 seconds. As soon as the sound man gives a thumbs up, you are speaking. And you're lucky if a helicopter doesn't jump in on a perfect take and kill that take. So there are all kinds of things you have to worry about that you never worried about. Or I'm walking across a bridge in London, looking backwards at the camera, hoping I'm not going to slam into somebody who has his head down, looking at a smartphone, walking in my direction. So it's just the kind of things you don't pick up when you're watching a documentary, but it was a hazardous documentary to me.
Well, but it does, in a lot of ways, make the documentary lively. I mean, a decision at one point was made that, of course, you're going to stand in the places where Shakespeare worked, or the Globe Theatre, but really, whenever you're on camera, you're in some modern location in London, not always directly connected, but it's that idea of that Ken Burns had to figure out. He did it another way when he was doing the Civil War stuff, of how do you do a documentary where there's no footage. There's he had still photographs at least. You don't even have that. So in order to make things sort of lively and, I guess, of modern interest, you'll show always crowds and people in the streets of London and the bridge. And I mean, was that your idea or his, or combination?
That was the plan all along, both my idea and his fine tuning and the work of a lot of people at various institutions in England who made available to me things that ordinarily are off limits even to scholars. For example, we did a bit in which I wanted to look at a gift that King James gave to a flattering historian who spent 8 years working up a genealogy for King James. And the gift was his diamond-encrusted medallion with a beautiful painting in miniature of King James by Hilliard, the greatest portrait painter of the age. Now, there's no way that the British Museum is going to let me anywhere near that object, except if I'm making a film that makes them look good as well. So it was part of the thrill of making this documentary was people were putting things in front of me, priceless jewels, invaluable paintings, documents and manuscripts that are incredibly exciting for me as a scholar to hold. And I got to do that because I was making this documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, for people who are still maybe a little on the fence and unconvinced, and it's sort of like, 30 years ago in America, they would send Geraldo Rivera to go dig up Al Capone's vault, and they build up all this ridiculous fake excitement for it and stuff like that. And yet, there are moments in the film where we capture your genuine excitement because someone is showing you a 400-year-old map. And the look on your face, and you're like, you've got the gloves on. Or even some of these books where I'm surprised you're not wearing gloves, and you're able to turn a page, and the historicity of that thrills you, and the thrill comes across on camera.
Yeah, I only wish that everybody watching that could hold that diamond-encrusted jewel, or look at these maps, or handle those rare books, or those first folios of Shakespeare. And even after doing this all of my adult life and looking at a lot of rare books and the like, it was an incredible thrill for me to not only just have access to this, but when I'm talking about the map with the world expert on maps from Shakespeare's day and learning so much. It was, a private tutorial with each expert in turn, and they could not have been nicer or more generous. So it was both a teaching experience for me, but also in a lot of ways a very exciting learning experience.
Now, we're talking with James Shapiro. He is a professor at Columbia, teaching comparative literature there, and of course an expert on Shakespeare. At what point did you realize that your life would be so consumed with William Shakespeare?
It would not have been as a teenager. I took Shakespeare as a 13, 14-year-old in public school in inner city New York, and I hated it. Everybody else in class seemed to be getting it, laughing at the dirty jokes. It just went by me, and I just didn't understand what the big deal was about Shakespeare. I never took a Shakespeare course in college.
Oh my gosh.
Well, it would never have occurred to me to do that. My friends who did got bad grades, so they warned me away from doing that. And to tell you the truth, I became a Shakespearean in the late 70s. Freddie Laker and others were making it possible for American kids to fly over to London or elsewhere in Europe for $100 or $200 round trip. And you could sleep in church basements or youth hostels for, $1 or $2 a night and see the Royal Shakespeare Company or Shakespeare at the National Theater or in the Edinburgh Festival for pennies. And I started doing it, and it was like a drug. It was, in fact, better than any drug I might have been consuming at the time. And I'd go for about 3 weeks to London after working to make enough money at some crummy job in New York, and I'd land in London and see a play a day and 2 on matinee days. And after about 4 or 5 years, I'd probably seen 100, 120 plays at a really golden moment of the London stage. And these, I just saw Shakespeare. That's all I wanted to see. Just devoured this stuff. So my Shakespeare is a living, breathing, theatrical experience. And one of the huge thrills for me is now I'm on the board of governors of the Royal Shakespeare Company. So to be able to imagine that I began as a kid who was 18, 19, just seeing these plays in the theater after 30 years of teaching and writing books about them, I'm now at the other end of things as part of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I advise on all Shakespeare productions at New York's Public Theater. So it's pretty much 24/7 for me now on both sides of the Atlantic. But I'm always aware that a lot of people out there were as turned off to Shakespeare as I was as a teenager, and most of my professional life, including on this documentary, has been spent trying to figure out how to make people understand why it's worth paying attention to Shakespeare.
Can I ask, what was the first Shakespeare play that you remember seeing at the RSC and how it rocked you?
Yeah, that's a good question. They all blew me away, and I just remember sitting during intermission, almost weeping in my seat as people plied by to get a drink at the bar. Just small productions that were extraordinary. Seeing Alan Howard play Henry VI up in Stratford, seeing just extraordinary productions like Titus Andronicus with Brian Cox that just were devastating. And, just even describing them, I'm remembering the experience. There was a scene in Titus Andronicus where Lavinia, the daughter of the soldier Titus, walks on stage having been raped and having had her hands cut off and her tongue cut out. And a woman about 3 seats away from me started laughing uncontrollably. And it was this frightening moment in the theater as somebody was having a post-traumatic response to seeing a rape victim on stage. And the actors were so good. I thought the rapist had been released from some state pen just to perform in that production. So you cannot forget Shakespeare when it is as vivid and as terrifying a theatrical experience as that.
Now, you must have been a smart kid because the language did not stand in your way. In other words, when you first started to see these plays, you hadn't read the script first, you hadn't poured over like the Folger ones with the translations or definitions on the other side of the page, like I did all those years ago. I mean, that wasn't a barrier?
If your experience of Shakespeare is reading a line and then looking at the footnotes and then reading a line and looking at the footnotes, you might as well just close the book and walk away. That's not how he wrote the plays. That's not why he wrote the plays. He wrote them to be experienced in the theater. I assure you, in Shakespeare's day, 10% of the play went by everybody. It goes by too fast. But he wrote plays in which you can pretty much figure out where you are. And when you see them again and again, fill in those blanks. So, and it's worth remembering that Shakespeare invented a lot of words. And in any given play, there might be 10 or 20 or 30 words playgoers had never heard before in their lives. So no one as smart as they were would have gotten everything. And my advice for people is just put away the text, go to see a production, however good or however bad that production is, and that has to be your introduction to Shakespeare. And I have a 16-year-old son at home, and I wanted to make sure his experience growing up was not like mine. And the rule was we'd go to see Shakespeare plays, and the minute he was bored, we'd just walk out. And we walked out of a lot of plays, and I probably embarrassed myself by doing that. But kid loves Shakespeare. He acts in Shakespeare now. He can hold his own with me in any kind of Shakespeare discussion. And I remember taking him at 5 to London to see A Midsummer Night's Dream, and his teachers in New York were always saying, "Oh, he's not paying attention. He's distracted in class." And I would tell him he's distracted because you're a boring teacher. And they didn't much appreciate that. I said, I'm going to take him to see a Shakespeare play. It'll last 3 hours. Let's see how distracted he is. And he saw this Midsummer Night's Dream, and at one point, Puck is throwing fairy dust at the audience. And he's grabbing it off the ground and shoving it in his pocket because nobody else is saving the fairy dust. For him, it was real. And it just reminded me that Shakespeare in production is a transformative thing. Whether you're 5 or 95, it stays the same way.
Now, speaking of 5 and 95, and you've been teaching for 25, 30 years, are you teaching the same way that you did when you first started? Are the kids the same, or is everything so technological and PDA and whatever oriented that you've had to change your style of how you even approach or dole Shakespeare out for generations of the past 10, 15 years?
That's a great question. And because I've been teaching at Columbia for, I guess, since 1985, and I taught at Dartmouth and Goucher colleges before then, but I'm teaching in the same physical classroom for all these years. I'm old school. A lot of friends who are really good Shakespeare teachers show film clips, do all the kind of twittering and all that stuff. I just walk in there with chalk, no electronic devices, smartphones allowed in my room, and we just hash it out. And I have students act out scenes in almost every class.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And it is intense. And I live in a neighborhood where 2 weeks ago I was teaching a great play called The Revenger's Tragedy, which is a kind of remake of Hamlet by a man named Middleton. And in it, a guy is carrying around the skull of his ex-girlfriend for about 9 years, hoping to take revenge on the guy who drove her to her death. And I just went about 50 yards from my office to a neighborhood store which sells Halloween stuff. Yeah. And I said, I need a skull, a wig, and a couple of knives. And they said, that'll be $19.99. And I walked out and brought it to class and had the kids act it out. And it was brilliant. And I could have showed them a film clip of The Revenger's Tragedy. There's a pretty good movie of it made. But there's nothing like watching your classmates act stuff out. And so you don't need more than the prop Shakespeare had, is what I'm saying. Just a simple room, enough space to act stuff out, and a kind of willingness on the part of students to go with the flow a little bit and embarrass themselves, and everybody gets a chance to do that. And you learn from watching all that kind of stuff too. But unless you season it with a little acting, you can forget what made these plays so exciting in their own day.
And sorry to go a little farther afield, but I'm just a little curious because I'm connected with, a university here, and my wife is, and I'm just wondering, having taught for 30 years, do you see, in general, even apart from Shakespeare, that the students are smarter, dumber, faster, more distracted, the same?
Columbia gets 27,000 applicants for a class of 1,000. So we're a competitive institution. That having been said, over a quarter century, what has been, and I went to Columbia at a time when they took 50% of the kids, a long time ago, and I wasn't a very good student. I was a pretty good athlete, varsity athlete, and that took up most of my energies as an undergraduate. But the bottom 20% is gone, the kids who just are not good thinkers. Everybody's pretty good, but the top 10% of quirky, independent minds, they're also gone. It seems like in the competitive drive to get into colleges in America today, high schools are producing much more conventional students, kids who know how to tick all the right boxes, do all the right interning. So I really miss the truly brilliant, quirky kid who's gone and who would have ideas that would never have been dreamt of by a professor that were far better than any I could come up with. And but you get a lot of really super competent students who are a little, it's a challenge to get them out of their safety zone, and that's my job as a teacher.
Can you remember a revelatory moment from years ago where you were teaching a particular Shakespeare play and somebody came up with an idea that just knocked you for a loop?
I'll give you an example, not so much of an idea, but of an attitude.
Okay.
Teaching The Rape of Lucrece, which is a very sad story about a woman whose husband is bragging about how chaste and wonderful and good-looking his wife is, and a guy listening to that leaves and goes over to her place and rapes her, and threatens, actually, before he rapes her, that if she doesn't go along with it, he'll kill the slave and kill her and put them in bed together and make it look like she was caught sleeping with a slave. So she has no real choice except to go through with it, and at the end calls her husband and her father back and kills herself after pointing out who had raped her. And I had a student come to class and say, I refuse to study this. I think this is exploitative. Shakespeare puts you in a position where you are looking at the rape from the perspective of a rapist. I do not want to be put in that position. And she just walked out of class. And I thought that was incredible and gutsy and sincere. And I haven't seen that in about 15 years.
I don't know about... I don't know. I've got to say, when I was going to New York University, and I was in film school, and you had people protesting the showing of Birth of a Nation because the last third of the film is glorifying the Ku Klux Klan, and I'm like,
right.
Yeah, but this is 60 years ago.
I don't know if you'd see it anymore. I don't know if that kind of protesting spirit exists as it did when we went to school. I really don't.
Yeah, well, no, but I disagreed with protests, though. I didn't think...
Okay, you didn't like the idea that... Well, no, my rule is, in all my years of teaching, I've never missed... at Columbia, I've never missed a class or been late to a class. Nothing should disrupt the educational experience. But if you want to complain, you want to stand outside the classroom, that's fine, as long as you don't stop somebody else from going in and getting the education they pay for and deserve.
Well, you started teaching after the mid-'60s, so you would have missed probably all that stuff that was going on.
Right, and at Columbia, police came on campus and broke heads, so there's a strong cultural memory of protesting on this campus.
Well, I'm sorry that I pulled you so far afield. I do want to...
No, it's all connected.
Yeah, I guess in a way. And we are connecting James Shapiro to Dave's Gone By. Wow, that was a terrible segue. But he is the the author of a few books, including Year in the Life of Shakespeare, 1599, Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare, and, well, I mean, you've been all over the internet and interviewed a zillion times about this, but we can go just a little while on this, if you don't mind, on this whole idea that people say, or at least in the past 150 years, there's been some contesting of the fact that, well, no, Shakespeare couldn't have written all those plays or all those plays alone, and it had to be so-and-so Bacon or whoever. But your research has really centered back to the fact that he probably did.
You know, one of the nightmares for Shakespeareans is going up to class the first day and having somebody raise a hand and say, I was told that Shakespeare didn't write the plays himself. And the idea for this book, Contested Will, came when I was teaching a group of fourth graders at a nearby school, neighborhood school, and one of the kids said, my brother told me Shakespeare didn't write Romeo and Juliet. And I realized it's now at the fourth grade level. And how many high school or elementary and middle school teachers are equipped to answer that question? And it's not enough just to kind of pull up all my authority and say, trust me, I know. So I spent 5 or 6 years researching and writing that book in order to put to bed why a lot of smart people, Helen Keller, Mark Twain, Henry James, Sigmund Freud, at one point or another in their lives believe that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. And it was a fun book to write. It was a pretty devastating book because you're showing what happens when smart people go off the rails. And there's enough at the end of the book to show overwhelmingly why Shakespeare did write Shakespeare. And also to point out that to deny Shakespeare the right to have written his plays essentially amounts to saying he lacked the imagination to write them, that somebody who was a Glover's son from Stratford couldn't write these plays, only an aristocrat could have written these plays. And if you know anything about aristocrats, there are a few aristocrats who've been great writers because they've lacked the hunger and the drive and the ambition that most writers have had. Be that as it may, I felt I have no problem wasting 5 good years of my life if I can write a book that every teacher can then quote or refer to in putting this question to rest. And it turned out to have pretty good timing because the brilliant filmmaker Roland Emmerich, just as I finished the book, came out with a movie called Anonymous, in which he argued that the Earl of Oxford was the true author of Shakespeare's plays. And I got to go one-on-one with Emmerich at the New Yorker Festival, and I love, Independence Day. I like a lot of his movies, and I think he's a great filmmaker. But what he knows about Shakespeare, you can put in a thimble. And it was a little worrying to me that a major motion picture by a major Hollywood studio would be out there making the case that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. The film completely tanked. American and foreign audiences were not fooled. And I got to write some pieces in the New York Times and elsewhere pointing out just how dumb this was. So there are various points where scholars actually matter outside of a classroom, and whether it's taking on a film like that or making a documentary like the one that we were talking about earlier, Shakespeare the King's Man. It's fun for me. I grew up in a tough Brooklyn neighborhood. I don't mind a fight. And somebody's going to have to fight wrong-headedness and conspiracy thinking. The book was as much about where we are now in America, where for every fact there are 3 conspiracy theories. So you really have to figure out how you can get at some notion of historical accuracy.
Well, I mean, there is, I will say, and forgive me for not remembering all the details, but I think in the third section of your documentary, there is one play that you're presumably admitting was co-written. You even go to an expert who says, well, some of these lines would have been written by, I'm forgetting, I don't know if it was Beaumont or who it was.
Yeah, no, it was Fletcher. And one of the things that's changed in the last 30 years in the Shakespeare business, or in the teaching of Shakespeare's plays, is for a long time, Shakespeareans idolized Shakespeare to such an extent whether it's Shakespeare's or most films and great TV series today are deeply collaborative. And Shakespeare understood that his work was always collaborative with actors to begin with, as well as with other writers. So I'm a big believer in talking about Shakespeare both as a solo artist and, when the time came to it, as somebody who collaborated with other writers when he felt the need to do so. And, I'm not just picking on people who don't think Shakespeare was Shakespeare. I'm picking on anybody who's pushing wrong-headed or closed-minded ideas. And I take issue with people who think nobody was great enough to have collaborated with Shakespeare. Shakespeare didn't think so, and his contemporaries didn't think so.
Yeah. Now, we'll finally actually get to talk a little bit about the DVD set, that Shakespeare, The King's Man, which also, there's a book as well, but I've only seen the DVD that just
There's no book. There's no book on that. Most of the people who do these kind of DVDs pump out a book with it, and I deliberately didn't, because I knew that if I did, I'd be trying to speak to two kind of audiences at once. So this is just a straight 3-hour documentary that takes you from Shakespeare in 1603, when Queen Elizabeth died and King James came to the throne, to Shakespeare in 1613-14, when he called it quits and stopped writing and went home to Stratford.
And one of the big case that DVD makes, that the series makes, is that Shakespeare was changed irrevocably, and his plays were changed by this different succession to the throne, by the fact that James I was, although certainly not as beloved as Elizabeth, he was also a very creative person. He wrote a lot of things himself. He was published constantly. A smart man, but also a man given to lavishness, which, every single thing that you pick up on, and this is what makes it fascinating. You tie history in with art in a way that too few professors and too few scholars and filmmakers do. And you show, because this was a facet of James I's first's personality that ended up affecting what Shakespeare was doing and the next play that he wrote, and this, the Gunpowder Plot or whatever. And I just find that incredibly fascinating.
I have always loved microhistory. I love to know how the weather shapes things. And the first time I did it was in a book called 1599, A Year in Shakespeare's Life, and that I started in 1988 and finished and published in 2005. So
Good Lord.
It took 15 years. It just takes a really long time to fill in that canvas. And the work that I was doing in Shakespeare the King's Man is setting up the next and last big book I'll write, which is a book about Shakespeare in 1606. So the second hour of that documentary spends a lot of time on 1606, and in a few years I hope to actually finish that book if I can. So I really want to get to as fine-tune the notion of the relationship between life and literature. I lived in New York City all my life, and most of it, and know the difference between New York before 9/11 and after 9/11, and in America before 9/11 and after 9/11. And I know that everybody listening really can feel the difference between, say, living in President Bush's America, living in President Obama's America. We feel that. We see it in our daily lives. We see it in our foreign entanglements. We see it in questions of immigration or gun control, lots else. And what I was trying to do was talk about what happens when Queen Elizabeth dies and King James takes over. An even more fundamental shift, because Queen Elizabeth was the only monarch Shakespeare, who was born in 1564, knew his entire life until she died in 1603. So a new king comes in, and for all he knew, it would be the king for the rest of his life, and was. So Shakespeare only lived under two monarchs, and regime change had a profound effect on his work, especially because so many of his plays deal with regime change. So it was something he thought about, and something that affected his plays hugely. And I just tried to make the case for that in a way that I think had not sufficiently been made, and that's really what that documentaries about.
I mean, what was kind of interesting is that he flourished under Elizabeth, but it was King James who made him the king's man and guaranteed him a secure place and a secure job for as long as he wanted it. So he got kind of lucky.
Anybody's ever worked for one boss, and then that boss dies and a new boss comes in, knows that it's pretty unnerving right at the beginning. And everybody likes to think, oh, Shakespeare, was on cruise control for 25 years of a writing life. And that just wasn't the case. He had to be very nervous when Queen Elizabeth died, and it looked like things might not go as well for him in the future. It turned out to be great in different ways, but that's the story that I tell.
And he certainly did, a bit better off than Ben Jonson. Why do you think Jonson had so much trouble? Because, Shakespeare wasn't just writing, gold-stamped I Love the King plays. Why did Jonson get arrested a few times and all that?
I just finished teaching a course that had a lot of Ben Jonson in it, and at the end of the course, I said to the students, any suggestions you want to make before I teach this next year? And they said, just do less Ben Jonson, will you? We can't take 3 Ben Jonson plays. And I said, I'll cut it back to 2, although it pains me. Jonson couldn't quite figure out how to write to his audience. He wrote above them, he wrote below them, he wrote around them, he sucked up to King James, he put down King James. He just never kind of figured out how to connect with his audience in a way that Shakespeare did. And I think he was an angrier guy, a brilliant guy, a frustrated guy in ways that Shakespeare probably wasn't.
Huh. Now, another book that James Shapiro has written, and that now that I know it exists, I'm going to go out there and get it, is Shakespeare and the Jews. As one myself, and I'm presuming from your last name, and forgive me if I'm overreaching, you are one too?
I am a Jew, as Shylock says. And this was another area, as you can probably guess by now in our conversation, that as somebody who came late to Shakespeare studies, I was always kind of thrown by the things that people took for granted that just weren't true, or myths like Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, and those things really bring out the Brooklyn in me and make me want to destroy bad thinking and bad arguments. So when I was starting to study Shakespeare and read around, everybody said there were no Jews in Shakespeare's day, and therefore there were no Jewish questions.
I had heard that he had never met one. Is that fallacy?
Well, it's just untrue. I mean, we don't know how many Jews Shakespeare would have met, but if Shakespeare or anybody else in Elizabethan London wanted to speak with somebody who had been raised as a Jew, there was actually a convert's house in the center of London, where the old public records office was, near Holborn Street, and you could speak to a man named Yehuda Menda, who converted in London and lived there under the name Nathaniel Menda.
Still a pretty Jewish name.
So
yeah.
There was a community of 100 to 200 Jews living in Shakespeare's London. And aside from the fact that there were actual Jews passing through London or living in London, every major writer of the period, Marlowe, Donne, Johnson, Dekker, every theologian wrote about Jews. Everybody wrestled with Jewish questions because it was just one of the ways of wrestling with what it meant to be English. Jews were different. They were a different nation, religion, they spoke a different language, they had different customs. And one of the ways in which this culture came to define itself was by defining itself in relationship to what it wasn't. And the Jews figured very largely in that. In Marlowe's play, the
Jew of Malta,
in Shakespeare's great The Merchant of Venice. So that book took 6 or 7 years to write, and I was happy I wrote it, and happy to move on from that subject and not just spend the rest of my life talking about Shakespeare and the Jews.
Well, sure, but have you been able to, have you reconciled the author of The Merchant of Venice in the sense that, he was writing a comedy with a happy ending, and I personally can't see it as such?
the man lived 400 years ago in a different culture, and Jews figured in the mindset of that culture in different ways. People ask me, was Shakespeare anti-Semitic? I have no idea whether Shakespeare hated Jews, loved Jews. All he understood was that Jews were a great subject for drama, even as he figured that Othello, as a black general married to a white woman, was another radioactive and electrifying subject for drama, even as he understood that a weak king like Henry VI or a tyrannical one like Macbeth were great subjects for drama. So I don't pass judgment on Shakespeare because I don't know what Shakespeare thought. All I know is what these plays explore, and my job is to try to have a lot more free time to do this than most people, to research what was in the air and on the ground when Shakespeare was writing.
Yeah, it's just, you can read Othello, but Othello just doesn't seem anti-black. It doesn't seem like he's making fun of or putting down Othello because he happens to be dark-skinned. He just happens to be a jealous...
Productions that really do that and leave you feeling very disturbed. And if you just, listen to the beautiful lines of poetry given to Iago denigrating Othello, it's there's some dark stuff in that play.
But Iago's the bad guy, as opposed to the folks in the Merchant of Venice who are the quote-unquote...
Bad guys have great lines, too.
Oh, yeah, but I'm saying when people make fun of and destroy Shylock, it's supposedly the good guys who are doing it. So there's a... Right,
both ways, though. It works the same way. You can say that Shylock shows his humanity. He's a man like Lear, more sinned against than sinning. These plays continue to have life after 400 years because they're not sermons. They don't work in any one way or another. And I'm interested in how they are received. I don't see the play as anti-Semitic or philo-Semitic. I see it play out in history, so that why did the Nazis stage it as often as they did? Why and how is it staged in Israel today? It tells me, in other words, about our own world or our recent world as much as it does about Shakespeare's.
I mean, it was in some ways an awful production, but it was the most profound production for me. I don't know if you ever saw Peter Sellers' version of Merchant that he was bringing around. Not Peter Sellers, the funny Pink Panther guy. I mean, Peter Sellers, the avant-garde.
I didn't. I saw his Othello, but I didn't see his Merchant.
It was. On some level, it was badly acted and just a weird, ridiculous production. But it was also so incredibly depressing and dark and ugly. And when you came out of it, you realized you were watching a tragedy. And it was like the first time, I was like, okay, it doesn't work, but it's the one that feels emotionally right.
See, that's, at a certain time in a certain place, that can happen. And a good cultural historian keeps his finger on the pulse of precisely how productions like the ones you're describing change the way we think about a play. The plays don't stay the same.
We have just another moment or two left with James Shapiro, who's just been an absolute as I assumed, delight to talk to about Shakespeare, about his DVD set, Shakespeare, the King's Man, and about his books. I'm kind of wondering what your favorite Shakespeare either plays or moments or experiences have been in very recent times, over the past, 5 or 10 years, be it at the RSC or at the Public or wherever.
I remember reading an interview with Baron Rothschild about the vineyard guy, the wine man, about what was his favorite bottle of wine. And his answer was, a cheap carafe that somebody brought to him and his wife when they were young and in love. And that bottle tasted great. And when people ask me what my favorite Shakespeare play production is, I just think about seeing a play with a friend or with my son, or seeing my son in a play, or seeing a bunch of high school kids who really get it, or do a scene brilliantly. So I take away something exciting from really every production that I'm involved with. And I'm involved with one right now at the Public Theater that's going to be a brilliant Antony and Cleopatra that's going to tour in Stratford-upon-Avon with the RSC, and in New York at the Public Theater, and down in Miami as well. And it's just a brilliant, brilliant director, a brilliant company, a brilliant producing team.
Well, Well, I mean, why? In other words, what makes it special? What's the take on it?
The key is, I guess, bringing something fresh from the moment to the play, which has been out there waiting for this kind of... there's a young, incredibly talented African-American playwright named Terrell McCraney, and he's decided he's going to direct Antony and Cleopatra, which is about the toughest play to direct, and he's going to set it in Haiti in the 19th century and talk about issues of race and difference. And it sounds PC, and it's not. It's just teasing out things that are dormant in that text and making that play come more alive through his insights as an American living today than people have done for a while. And it's hard to explain, but you sit in rehearsals and you watch him figure things out that are not dreamt of in your philosophy. And you realize how exciting it is to do Shakespeare, to see productions, and to teach this stuff.
And it sounds like you're not against putting Shakespeare in modern dress, moving it to different times. Are you opposed to cutting? I assume you're opposed to changing the language.
Plays were in modern dress. Everybody thinks that Shakespeare was somehow, must somehow be done as if it's a bubble or something like that. The costumes Shakespeare's characters used to play aristocrats or kings and queens were bought secondhand from aristocrats who were recycling clothes they couldn't wear 2 or 3 times. They were modern dress, we would call it. So that's another kind of fallacy and wrongheadedness that I try to combat. No, I love to see fresh ideas. I hate to see dumb ideas or mechanical ideas or let's do Shakespeare this way, that way, because I feel like it. There has to be a reason. There has to be an electrical connection between the moment and the production and the interpretation, and that's very rare. And when you see it and feel it, you'll remember it forever.
Well, James Shapiro, this has been a very rare experience, I think, for all of us listening here on Dave's Gone By. I want to tell everybody, please, 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 go get yourself a copy of Shakespeare the King's Man. Tremendously rewarding 3 hours of your life. And if you have more hours, go get Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare. Go get Shakespeare and the Jews, the book $15.99. And in a couple of years, please get the book that you are slaving over now. And I'm sure we'll be...
1606.
1606. When do you think you'll finish it, roughly?
Shakespeare's the 400th anniversary of his death's coming up in 2016, and so. I think my publishers have guards posted outside my office door, and I'm not allowed to leave until it's written by then.
And I think that's absolutely right of them. A real pleasure. James Shapiro, thank you.
Talking.
Thank you so much.
All right, my pleasure.